What if a millionaire's cruel plan to humiliate his humble maid in front of an elitist audience took an unexpected turn? When Emily Sullivan, with her quiet strength and unwavering dignity, walked through the doors of the luxurious dinner, no one imagined the impact her presence would have. Not even him. What happened that night changed lives forever. Emily woke up every day before the sun rose, always at 5 in the morning. The old alarm clock next to her bed rang with a sharp sound that seemed to echo through the small one-bedroom apartment where she lived with her sick mother, a frail woman with a tired voice who depended entirely on her. At 28, Emily already bore the weight of responsibilities that felt much greater than her age. Her routine began with a quick shower and a silent prayer as she tied her brown hair into a simple bun. She put on her uniform, a faded blue dress and worn black shoes, reflecting the simplicity of her life. The journey to Richard Donovan's mansion was made by bus, and Emily used the minutes on the crowded transport to mentally review the day's tasks. Donovan's mansion was immense, a luxurious structure situated on a hill overlooking the city. As she passed through the imposing golden gates, Emily knew she had to leave behind any signs of fatigue or personal worry. Inside, she was just the maid. The day began with cleaning the grand main hall, whose floor-to-ceiling windows let in stunning light. While dusting the expensive furniture and organizing the books on the shelves, Richard would often appear with his critical gaze and a cup of coffee in hand. He was an imposing man in his 40s, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits. His words were few, but laden with disdain. "Don't you think this mirror should be cleaner, Emily? This is a mansion, not a barn," he would say, without even looking directly at her. Emily swallowed the humiliation, replied with a polite, "Yes, Mr. Donovan," and returned to her work. Throughout the day, Emily washed clothes, ironed expensive shirts, cooked elaborate meals, and still found time to organize Richard's office papers. Her tired expression was evident by the end of the afternoon, but her clear, bright eyes always maintained an expression of kindness and determination. There was an inner strength that seemed to drive her, even when Richard treated her like someone invisible or dumped harsh comments on her. When she finally returned home at night, she carried shopping bags to prepare dinner for her mother. The woman greeted her with a weak smile, which for Emily was like a reward after a difficult day. She helped her mother eat, administered the necessary medications, and only then had a brief moment for herself. Often, while looking out the small apartment window at the city lights, Emily wondered if one day her life would be different, but even so, she never allowed hope to fade. Emily was an ordinary woman in extraordinary circumstances, someone the world often overlooked, but who continued to move forward with a quiet strength. Richard Donovan was in his office, absorbed in thoughts revolving around his next big idea. He was a man who delighted in the control he exerted over those around him, and few things amused him as much as humiliating those he considered inferior. Sitting in his black leather armchair, with a glass of whiskey in hand and his eyes fixed on nothing, he wore a smile that could only be described as cruel. That afternoon, while watching Emily's dedicated and always submissive employee, an idea took shape. "Why not bring her to one of my dinners? As a guest?" he murmured to himself, savoring the irony of the situation. The image of Emily, with her simple clothes and shy demeanor, lost among his rich and arrogant friends, seemed irresistible to him. He had no intention of integrating her. The idea was to create a spectacle. Seeing how she would react to an environment she clearly did not belong to would be his form of entertainment. The next morning, Richard found Emily in the hallway as she was cleaning one of the ornate mirrors in the main hall. He approached with deliberately light steps, watching her for a few moments before speaking. "Emily," he called, his voice laden with a tone that mixed authority and disdain. She immediately stopped what she was doing and turned, still holding the cleaning cloth. "Yes, Mr. Donovan? I have something special for you," he began, holding out a white envelope with golden details. He handed it to her with a theatrical gesture, as if it were an invaluable honor. "This Saturday night, I'm hosting a dinner here at the mansion. I want you to be present as my guest." Emily blinked a few times, clearly confused. She looked at the envelope and then at Richard, trying to understand if this was serious. In the 2 years she had worked for him, she had never received any gesture suggesting consideration. "As a guest, sir?" "Exactly," he replied with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I thought it would be interesting for you to participate. Dress as well as you can, of course. It's a formal event. She hesitated, feeling her heart race. Emily didn't know if this was a rare opportunity or some kind of cruel joke, but she also didn't feel capable of refusing. I appreciate the invitation, sir. I will do my best to be there. Great, Richard said, giving a slight smirk before turning his back and leaving. Don't be late. Emily stood in the hallway, looking at the envelope in her hands. Inside, there was a formal invitation with golden letters detailing the event. Her name, Emily Sullivan, was handwritten at the top, as if she were truly a guest of honor. A whirlwind of emotions took over her. Anxiety, curiosity, and even a thread of hope. Perhaps, she thought, this was a sign that Richard saw her differently, that there could be something more beyond orders and disdainful glances. Emily held the $20 bill tightly as she walked through the streets of downtown. The small amount was all she could spend, and each step felt heavy with responsibility. Her destination was a thrift store located in a more remote neighborhood, a place where she hoped to find something that was both affordable and suitable for dinner at Richard Donovan's mansion. Upon entering the store, she was greeted by the smell of old fabric and the sound of hangers being handled. She carefully navigated the narrow aisles, running her fingers over the textures of dresses that ranged from extravagant to worn out. After nearly an hour of meticulous searching, she found what seemed perfect, a light blue dress, simply cut, but with subtle details on the sleeves and waist that made it special. The fabric, although not new, was in good condition, and the price fit exactly within her budget. Back at her apartment, Emily unfolded the dress on the bed and ran her hand over the fabric as if ensuring her choice. She took a small wooden box that she cherished and opened the lid. Inside were the jewelry inherited from her mother, a pair of pearl earrings and a necklace with a delicate pendant. She placed them next to the dress, mentally composing the image of how she would look. When it was time to get ready, Emily took a long shower, letting the water wash away some of the anxiety she felt. In front of the bathroom mirror, she wrapped a towel around her head and began to apply makeup with the little she had, a neutral lipstick and an old but functional mascara. Her goal was not to look stunning, but to present herself decently, something that wouldn't embarrass her. She carefully put on the dress, adjusting it on her body, and styled her hair in a low bun, leaving a few loose strands to soften her appearance. Finally, she put on the earrings and necklace, admiring herself for a moment in the small, stained mirror of the room. Emily didn't feel stunning, but there was something about that combination of clothes and accessories that gave her a small dose of confidence. Emily got out of the taxi in front of Richard Donovan's mansion, feeling her heart race in her chest. The bright lights illuminating the imposing facade seemed to amplify her sense of inadequacy. For a moment, she hesitated before taking the first step toward the door. She adjusted her light blue dress, firmly held the small purse she carried, and took a deep breath. "Head up, Emily," she murmured to herself, repeating the words her father had said so many times. As soon as she entered the grand hall, the atmosphere changed. The sound of lively conversation and clinking glasses diminished slightly, giving way to a succession of stares. The guests, dressed in expensive clothes and sparkling jewelry, watched her as if she were an intruder in sacred territory. Discreet whispers began to circulate, accompanied by muffled laughter. Emily felt her cheeks flush, but she maintained a firm posture, straightening her back and holding her gaze. Richard appeared with a wide, almost theatrical smile, which Emily immediately recognized as false. He wore an impeccable suit, and his presence seemed to fill the room with a dominant energy. "Ah, Emily, so glad you could make it." He opened his arms as if to welcome her warmly, but kept a calculated distance, which only reinforced the irony of his words. "Mr. Donovan, thank you for the invitation," Emily replied, in a polite but firm tone. Richard tilted his head slightly and looked around, calling the attention of his closest friends. "Let me introduce my special guest," he said, placing emphasis on the word special. His voice carried a lightness that to others sounded amusing, but to Emily, it had a cruel weight. "This is Emily Sullivan. She has been working with me for some time, a dedicated woman, from very humble beginnings, but with admirable determination." The words were met with contained laughter and barely concealed smiles. A tall, elegantly dressed woman whispered something to the man next to her, who looked Emily up and down before chuckling discreetly. Emily felt the ground seem less firm beneath her feet, but she remembered her father. Never let anyone put you down, my girl. Your dignity is yours, and no one can take it from you unless you allow it. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin and smiled, despite the pain growing inside her. It's a pleasure to meet all of you, she said with a calm and confident voice, even though her heart was racing. Richard seemed surprised by her response. He expected embarrassment or submission, but Emily's polite smile and unflappable demeanor left him momentarily speechless. Still, he didn't miss the opportunity to continue his game. I hope you enjoy the evening, Emily. We're here to celebrate the best things in life, aren't we? He gestured toward the table laden with elaborate dishes and crystal glasses. As the night progressed, Emily could feel the constant stares and hear the whispers that made no effort to be completely hidden. Who invited her? Why is she here? What courage to come dressed like that? These phrases echoed in her ears. But Emily maintained her posture, interacting with others politely, even though many made no effort to disguise their disdain. Every smile Emily gave, every word she responded with calmly, was a small personal triumph. She knew Richard intended to humiliate her, but she refused to give him or anyone else the pleasure of seeing her shaken. Inside, her emotions were on edge, but on the outside, she was the picture of tranquility. Emily didn't know what the rest of the night would bring, but she was sure of one thing. It would not be her who would lose her dignity in that hall. Emily was standing next to a luxurious buffet table, feeling increasingly out of place. She tried to appear calm while holding a glass of juice, but the weight of the stares and whispers around her made her heart race. It was then that she heard a deep, familiar voice call her name. Emily Sullivan? It can't be, said a tall, distinguished-looking man, approaching with a broad smile. It was James Carter, a respected businessman known for his charisma and integrity. He wore an elegant suit, but his warm gaze contrasted with the coldness of the other guests. Emily looked at him, surprised. "Mr. Carter?" she asked hesitantly. There was something in his eyes that seemed comforting, like a flicker of a distant memory. "My God, you are John Sullivan's daughter. I would recognize those eyes anywhere." He smiled genuinely and took Emily's hands, visibly moved. "Your father and I were very close friends. We worked together for years. He was an incredible man." James's words ignited something in Emily. Until that moment, the evening felt like a battle against subtle humiliations and judgmental looks. Now, in front of this man who spoke of her father with such respect, she felt a comforting warmth. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. My father always spoke very highly of you. He said you were a fair and trustworthy man." "And he was right about everything," James replied, chuckling lightly. "But what are you doing here? I didn't imagine John's daughter would be at an event like this." Before Emily could respond, James noticed something strange in the atmosphere around them. The fake smiles, the disdainful glances, the muffled laughter, all of it formed a picture he knew all too well. Someone was being used as a target for humiliation. He looked around carefully and saw Richard Donovan, standing on the other side of the hall, watching Emily with a barely concealed smirk of satisfaction. James was already familiar with Richard and his manipulation tactics. It didn't take long for him to understand what was happening. James turned to Emily, now with a more serious expression. "Emily, do you know why Richard invited you to this dinner?" She hesitated, feeling the knot in her stomach tighten. I'm not sure, Mr. Carter. I thought it might be a chance to be seen differently." James pressed his lips together, clearly indignant. "Unfortunately, I believe he has other intentions. Richard enjoys having fun at the expense of others, especially those he considers inferior. But let me tell you something, my dear. You are not inferior to anyone here." Emily felt warmth rise to her face, this time not from embarrassment, but from relief and strength. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Without wasting any time, James began to take action. He moved through the hall with elegance and discretion, starting conversations with other businessmen and prominent guests. While exchanging polite words and appearing to discuss business, he took the opportunity to reveal Richard's despicable attitude. "Did you know that Donovan invited a humble young woman just to publicly humiliate her?" he said in a low but firm tone. "It's not just unethical behavior, but also an attitude that damages the reputation of anyone associated with him." The other guests, many of whom already had their own reservations about Richard's arrogant personality, began to murmur among themselves. James, known for his integrity, was a respected figure in that circle, and his words carried weight. Gradually, the atmosphere in the hall began to change. The disdain that had previously been directed at Emily was now subtly shifting towards Richard. James didn't stop. He returned to Emily and, in an almost paternal manner, said, "Don't worry, my dear. This hall is full of people who think they are better than others, but you are the only one who carries true dignity here. Let's show them what it means to have character." As Richard, oblivious to the shifting dynamics, continued to socialize and boast, James had already planted the seeds of something greater. The atmosphere around them began to fill with evaluative looks directed at the host, and Richard Donovan's name was not being mentioned in a complimentary way. The turnaround was just beginning, and Emily, with her firm and silent posture, was now an inspiration to those who saw beyond appearances. The hall, once filled with light laughter and superficial conversations, was overtaken by an atmosphere of growing discomfort. Richard Donovan, who had started the evening as the center of attention, now found himself surrounded by furtive glances and whispers he could not decipher. It was a subtle but inevitable change, like a tide turning against him. Guests with whom he used to exchange cordial greetings were now avoiding him with hasty excuses. Influential businessmen, who typically sought his attention, were too busy talking among themselves. James Carter, on the other hand, remained calm and vigilant. He had been observing Richard's behavior throughout dinner, and each sarcastic comment or mocking smile directed at Emily reinforced his determination. Finally, when he realized that the tension had reached its peak, James decided it was time to act. The hall fell silent as James, with his lofty posture and firm voice, called Richard directly. "Donovan, I believe we have something important to discuss, and it's best that it be here in front of everyone." Richard, holding a glass of wine with his usual arrogance, raised his eyebrows, surprised by the interruption. "James, what's wrong? Is something wrong with dinner?" He tried to maintain a casual tone, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. James walked to the center of the hall, his gaze fixed on the host. He was a man known for measuring his words precisely, and each syllable seemed loaded with intent. "The problem isn't with the dinner, Donovan, but with the way you treat people. I've discovered that the invitation to this young woman, Emily Sullivan, was not an act of generosity, but a calculated attempt to humiliate her. You brought a worthy woman into this hall only to turn her into a target of ridicule. That is unacceptable." The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. All eyes turned to Richard, who, for the first time that night, could not disguise his discomfort. He tried to laugh, but the laugh came out forced. "Come on, James, you're exaggerating. It was just a joke. There was no malice." James raised his hand, interrupting him. "A joke? Do you think belittling someone who works hard, someone who deserves respect, is a joke? Let me say this. Anyone who sees others as inferior does not deserve to be in this circle. And from this moment on, I refuse to have any professional association with you." The impact was immediate. Whispers filled the hall, and several guests began to quietly agree. James, with his impeccable reputation, was a figure of influence, and his public statement was enough to tarnish Richard's image. Richard tried to react, his voice now nervous and almost desperate. "James, let's resolve this another way. You know how these events are. Sometimes things get out of control." "It's not just about this event, Donovan," James replied firmly. "It's about who you are. And everyone here, I believe, has the right to know who they're dealing with. A man who uses his power to humiliate others does not deserve to lead, much less be respected." James's statement was met with discreet nods of agreement. One of the most influential businessmen in the room stood up and walked toward James, extending his hand to him. "I completely agree. I'm canceling the deal we had planned, Richard. I won't do business with someone who behaves like this." Others began to do the same, one by one, and Richard's mask of control finally fell. He looked around, trying to find support, but no one seemed willing to defend him. His carefully constructed reputation over the years was crumbling before his eyes. Meanwhile, Emily, who had been watching the scene in silence, felt a mix of relief and surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her, much less in such a public manner. Looking at James, she saw not only her father's friend, but also a man of integrity who refused to tolerate injustices. Richard, with no options left, tried one last card, but his voice sounded weak. Emily, I'm sorry. Maybe I overreacted. I hope we can get past this. Emily lifted her chin, her posture reflecting the strength she had been carrying all night. Don't worry, Mr. Donovan. I've already moved on. I hope you learn from this too. The silence that followed was deafening. James placed his hand on Emily's shoulder and led her out of the hall, while Richard stood alone, surrounded by a crowd that no longer saw him in the same light. The night he had planned as a display of power had turned into his downfall. After the tumultuous dinner, as the guests began to leave Richard Donovan's mansion, James Carter asked to speak with Emily privately. He led her to the outdoor garden, where the soft moonlight illuminated the trees and the air was cooler and calmer. Emily, still surprised by everything that had happened, followed in silence, feeling her heart tighten with anticipation. When they reached a stone bench beside a gently murmuring fountain, James gestured for her to sit down. He stood for a moment, seemingly choosing his words carefully. Finally, he turned to Emily, his eyes filled with emotion. Emily, I need to say, you showed admirable courage today. The way you faced this situation, without losing your composure or dignity, was something few could manage. Emily, who had maintained a firm posture throughout the night, felt a lump form in her throat. Mr. Carter, I didn't do anything special. I just try not to let them destroy me. James smiled slightly and shook his head. You did much more than that. Your father, John, would have been proud. He was always an upright man, someone who believed that character was worth more than any wealth. And I see that you inherited that from him. James's words struck a deep chord in Emily, bringing forth memories of the father she had lost at a young age. He had always been her greatest example of strength and kindness. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Carter. My father was always my greatest role model. James sat down beside her, clasping his hands on his knees and looking directly at her. Emily, throughout my career, I have met many people, but few with the moral fiber you demonstrated today. And I want to be honest, I don't believe this place, this mansion, or this life as a housekeeper is what you deserve. You are capable of so much more. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but James raised his hand, asking to continue. I have a proposal for you. I need a personal assistant in my company, someone I can fully trust, who is hardworking, honest, and dedicated. After what I saw today, I have no doubt that you would be perfect for the position. Emily was stunned. Never in her life had she expected something like this. She looked at James with wide eyes, almost unable to believe what she had heard. Mr. Carter, is this serious? I don't know if I'm capable of taking on such an important position. James smiled, but this time there was firmness in his expression. I never make an offer without being sure, Emily. And believe me, you are more than capable. I see in your eyes the determination I saw in your father all those years ago. He always said you were special, that you had a bright future. Today, I had the privilege of confirming that for myself. Emily felt tears begin to well up, but she held them back, not wanting to appear fragile at such an important moment. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Carter. This opportunity, it means so much to me. But please know that I will give my best. Always. James placed his hand on her shoulder and smiled warmly. I expect nothing less, Emily. And please call me James. You are not just the daughter of an old friend. Now, you are part of my team, and we will work together to build something great. The two stood up, and James led her back to the mansion gate, where a car was already waiting to take her home. Emily got into the vehicle with a mix of relief, joy, and gratitude. As the car pulled away, she looked back, seeing the silhouette of the mansion and the lights still shining, and she knew she was leaving behind more than just a dinner. She was leaving behind a chapter of her life that had always limited her. Several months had passed since the fateful dinner at Richard Donovan's mansion, and Emily's life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Now working as a personal assistant to James Carter, Emily discovered a completely new world where her work was valued and where she herself was treated with respect and consideration. Her day started early, but unlike the exhausting and unrecognized routine she had at Richard's mansion, every task she performed now felt significant. As an assistant, she organized meetings, managed James's schedule, coordinated projects, and even participated in important discussions with the executive team. Her colleagues admired her for her competence and dedication, and James made a point of highlighting her work whenever he could. The turnaround in her life also brought benefits for her mother. With a fair salary and financial stability, Emily was able to provide her mother with the best medical care. Mrs. Sullivan's health began to improve, and she was able to walk around the house and chat animatedly with her daughter about the day's events. Every time Emily looked at her mother smiling, she felt that all the effort had been worth it. Meanwhile, Richard Donovan's fate was following an opposite trajectory. The scandal from that night spread quickly among business circles, tarnishing his reputation. One by one, the contracts he valued so much were canceled. His former allies, fearing association with someone of such despicable conduct, began to avoid him. Richard, once arrogant and confident, now faced isolation and financial difficulties. His mansion, once the stage for extravagant parties, had become a lonely and empty place. However, Emily did not waste time thinking about him. She was too busy enjoying her new life and a future that, for the first time, seemed promising. That morning, sitting in her new office, simply decorated but full of personality, Emily was reviewing some important documents for the upcoming meeting. The large windows let in sunlight, illuminating her workspace, which for her symbolized everything she had achieved. As she typed, she heard a soft knock on the door. James entered, bringing with him the same warm smile that always reminded her of her father. He was holding a folder, but didn't seem in a hurry to discuss business. Instead, he sat down in the chair across from her and watched her for a few seconds, as if he were evaluating something very important. "Emily," he began, with his deep and calm voice, "I wanted to tell you something. I've seen your growth over the past few months, and it's impressive how much you've evolved. But what impresses me the most is not just your competence. It's your integrity, your strength. You have an incredible ability to turn challenges into opportunities." Emily smiled, feeling the warmth of James's words. "Thank you, James. I owe you a lot. This opportunity has changed my life." James shook his head, smiling. "You did this for yourself, Emily. I just gave you a push. Everything you've achieved is your merit." He paused, and his tone softened. "Your father would be incredibly proud. He always said you had something special, that you would do great things." And he was right. The words touched Emily deeply. She felt her eyes welling up, but she maintained her smile. "Thank you, James. It means a lot to hear that." James stood up, placing the folder on the table. "Now let's get to work. We have an important meeting, and I know my best assistant has everything ready." He winked, and they both laughed. When James left, Emily looked out the window, watching the vibrant city below. In that moment, she felt that everything was exactly where it should be. Her life, her work, her family, everything seemed to have finally found balance. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel lost or invisible. She felt whole, and as the rays of sunlight illuminated her office, Emily took a deep breath and smiled, ready for whatever came next. After all, she had learned the most important lesson. Dignity and inner strength could never be taken from her, and that was what truly made her free.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to continue watching.